and shared our facts with other vice presidents and other persons we knew who could serve as key spokespersons. That way, we were able to use a number of people acting as spokespersons for the hospital so that we could all speak about the disaster at the same time. And frankly, in this case, help the news media as rapidly as possible.
The phone company was very good about putting extra lines in down to the airport. I mean, they literally called people in from home and at night and that type of thing to help, but there's still a time lag when that happens. The initial response of the hams, and this is basically always true in ham working a disaster, we're not the first responder. We're not there with the police, with the fire, with the ambulance. That's their bailiwick, that's what they do well first. We then come in after the initial response is done, after the flames are put out, after the people are moved to the hospital. We would then help with the securing of the site. We would help with the interagency communications. In other words, the fire department can talk to the fire department fine, but they can't talk to, say, the National Board of Transportation or the other agencies they don't normally deal with. We then would put a ham with each one of those agencies to give interagency communications. And so it was several hours later after the initial crash before we really got up and running into our position, our specialty, if you will, of the disaster. All the hams are strictly volunteers. They all have their own full-time jobs. This is strictly a hobby. They provide their own equipment, their own time, this type of thing. Cell phones were very new to Sioux City at that time. There was only one carrier in Sioux City at that time. They were excellent to work with. They immediately flew in from Denver a series of cell phones. These were then given to the hams. The hams then checked out the equipment, showed people how to run it, charged batteries, changed batteries, and then acted basically as a directory service. One of the big problems with the ham radio, with the cellular phones, is there's no way to find a number. There is no operator, there is no telephone book for cellular phones. So we kept track of who had what cellular number. So if you needed someone, knew they had a cell phone but didn't know what it was, you contacted a ham, we looked up to find out what number they were, and then provided that service as well. The cellular operations and the amateur radio frequencies make a very good marriage together. The cell phones will do some things that the ham radio can't do, and vice versa. There's some things that we can do better on ham radio than we can on the cell phones. Cell phones sometimes can be overloaded. Everyone uses them at the same time. Storm related, their towers can go down or power can go out, this type of thing. And not to say that ours can't too. So if you have both of them working together using the best of both, it's really the best way to communicate.
Had we booked motel rooms and scattered these survivors and family members out throughout the community, we'd have been stretched for not only personnel but resources to communicate to those folks. Those folks would have been isolated in motel rooms. They would have been exposed to the outside world, to the media, to whomever wanted to have access to them once they were located. Briarcliff College has limited access. There's only 2 entrances into Briarcliff College, so it was easy for us when we took the families there to control the access from the outside world to that. We had them all in one location. We were able to communicate with them. We were able to service the needs of those folks, not only the survivors of the crash, but the family members, the hundreds of family members that came to Sioux City after the incident to either be here with their loved ones that were hospitalized or to wait while the morgue operations were in a process to make positive identifications. Once we made a positive identification, it was easy to call Briarcliff to the staff that was there. They could go find the family. They were all on the same campus. There was a grief room set up where those family members were taken to where they were given the news about what the outcome of their loved one actually was. So it made Briarcliff really became a crisis within the crisis. It was a crisis center within the crisis, but yet remotely located away from the airport. So we didn't have family members trying to access the airport, trying to access the temporary morgue, trying to access the airfield, taking time away from the management team and the people that were trying to run this incident and process the fatalities. We were able to have that removed from the main hub of activity there at the airport.
You know, the college sits up on a hill and it's separated away, and it was July, and it was a cool July week, I remember that. And we'd had a lot of rain that summer, so it's a beautiful place anyway, and the conditions were optimal. And I remember one of the survivors was a man from Oregon and his nephew, and he was standing out by one of the buildings just looking out, and the words he used were, "Sister, this is a peaceful place, a very healing place for us." And so I think that the ambiance of the place was helpful. It also was helpful because we were able to keep until the overflow started, because then we had the survivors, we had the families of people who had come waiting to identify bodies, the families of people who had people in the hospitals, and somehow United just said, bring these people to Briarcliff. We had probably 500 people in the space of the week, in and out. So, but we were able to keep them all in one residence hall, and then the overflow went into the adjoining hall. And in fact, we have tunnels between buildings, and when the medical examiners wanted to meet with the people, and we didn't want the press to get at them, we would take them through the tunnel over into our large lecture hall. And so we were even able to do that. But it was really big. The chapel was here, and I oftentimes would see people in there. So I think there was a lot about the character of Briarcliff that made it a good place for those folks to help each other grieve, help each other heal, help each other answer the question, why did my daughter die and your daughter live? There was just very poignant, some of the encounters that happened. So I think between the college and the two hospitals, people knew that the people who had needs were at one of those three places. We had more food than we knew what to do with here, and then our food service, Airmark, decided they better get this organized. So they really took over the organization with the morgue food and the food here, because it was just kind of falling between the cracks. And the other thing, I think, were sheets. It's amazing. Sheets and phones and food. And I can remember someone calling, every sheet in town was gone. Some laundry in Vermilion brought sheets down, because our own students bring their own. We didn't have a supply of sheets. We needed something, and within an hour, somehow it was there. And then the clergy came here, and the counselors came here. And I can remember they had different rooms, different centers for the clergy and the funeral home directors and the counselors and the Red Cross, so that even those different services could coordinate with each other in one spot.
I dispatched a couple of my CPE students, clinical pastoral education students, to Briarcliff College that first night, because many of the walking wounded, those who were not hospitalized, went out to the college. Some 40 people stayed out there that night. One of my chaplaincy students told me later that he was there with that group of 30 or 40 as they watched the 10 o'clock news on television. As he watched with that group, that plane crashing and that fireball moving down the airport runway, they now saw from a different perspective what they had participated in as an intact passenger in that fuselage, and they just shuddered and were astounded at what they had been through, seeing it from a different perspective. And one Afro-American woman who was traveling with 5 other people, and all the other 5 were unaccounted for and presumed dead, and in fact they were dead. She was the only survivor out of that party. She started to shake, and my chaplaincy student held her and talked with her for 2 hours, just trying to unravel and also put together all the feelings, the emotions, the shock, the terror of what she had gone through.
When we did get a few calls from families who were very frantic, we would make sure we got a social worker immediately on the line. And in some ways, especially in the wee hours of the morning, we were sharing the same command post. So they were immediately there, actually not only to help those families, but frankly to reach out to any of us if we seemed overwhelmed.
The very thing that's making us famous was also one of our biggest problems. The thing that's making us most famous will be the enormous voluntary response. Because of the enormity of that response, that was also one of the most difficult things to control.
What we've done since the incident is we've put together a group of vests. We have orange for law enforcement, blue for EMS, and red for fire. Our incident command team, our management team, wears white. That sets the incident command team apart. Those vests are labeled with the different positions within the incident command system or incident management system. But now when a volunteer shows up on the scene, we're able to pass them the vest based on the tasks that they're going to perform while they're out there. So we're actually sending people into the field identified as to what role they're going to play, and it's easily identifiable to the other players that are out there what they're going to be doing.
We experienced a situation that was very special 10 years ago, and I think it could easily be duplicated today. We had a father who was hospitalized in our hospital with injuries, and he was also diabetic, so he really needed some care. And he left his family and his children back home in Germany. Certainly there was a situation where you could do some telephoning, but I found it incredibly touching. His children created pictures that basically said in German, "Get well, Papa." And a number of those pictures were pasted up around his room. It was just fabulous. It was so caring, and it was such a neat way to use a fax machine as that kind of a tool.
I think a community needs to search out within the community a trusted individual or a group of individuals that can come in and help document this activity. I think it's important that you really scrutinize who you're going to have do that. You run the risk, if you don't review who that is, you run the risk of that information being either given out to the media or given out to sources that you don't want it to go to. But I think it's important not only for case study and for after action and looking at what took place in ways that you can improve on what you did, but I think it's important to document for history purposes, for learning experiences for other communities, what went on within that event. And I think you have to find a trusted resource within your community that can come in, do that work, and you know that it will stay secure and available only to the team for the purposes they want it for.
The reason why this exercise was successful was the fact that they were prepared, they did exercise, and everybody knew everybody. The critiques, everybody got together, and I think that's very important, knowing who you're working with. We found it out just as far as working in the airport terminal, knowing the custodians, the laborers, the foremen. It was invaluable, and I'm sure on the rescue side of it, it had to be a very, very big plus. Thank you. Myself and my staff have always geared ourselves to 727s, 737s, DC-9s, and this sort of stuff, and our plan was based on that. 30, 40 casualties, something in this order. I think that the point to be made here is that one of my employees went out that afternoon, looked up and seen 17 contrails overhead. So no matter what size airport you have, you never know who may drop in on you. And I think you have to plan for that contingency.
You've got a highway, you've got a road, you've got the potential for a chemical emergency, a mass transit, a bus accident, a school bus accident. You got less resources. All that means is you have to plan better to utilize those limited resources totally effective. That plan has to be able to use those resources totally effective in every situation. So those smaller communities may not have the hazards that larger communities have and may have limited resources. Their challenge is even greater to be more effective with their planning process, to use the resources they have to the best of their ability.
But I think what we learned was that there is a certain amount of ability to take the moment and have the skills a person needs to adapt to that. Sometimes I think our plans might get a little too rigid and we might have to adapt them. And so what is that skill we need when a disaster happens? Probably the most important one is A, to keep presence of mind, and not lose it, and B, to be able to read a situation quickly and make some decisions. And maybe the third thing is to find the natural leaders that can, in the midst of it, even though the official people might be bing, 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 sometimes you've got a volunteer there who is obviously able to direct a group better.
Well, it's important to reduce into writing your plan. Over the 10 years since the incident of Flight 232, there's been a number of changes in our system, not only in personalities and people in management level positions, but street level people. If you don't reduce your plan to writing, there's no way for new people as they come into the system to be aware of where you're at in the planning process. The other thing you need to look at is technology. What's changing in our environment? We could not go back today and repeat and do exactly what we did on July 19, 1989 over again, because technology has changed. The number of resources within the system have changed. You need to reduce your plan and your resources into a written form and then constantly be reviewing those and updating those. That's one of the effective things of having the disaster committee is we're constantly reviewing those issues. We're constantly reviewing those resources. We're looking at what's changing in the environment around us, what technology changes are taking place. You need to be ready for that community to come forward. We had hundreds of phone calls from people within the community wanting to provide food and shelter and transportation, expertise, anything they could do, type, file, anything that we needed, there was somebody offering that resource and that service within the community. And that's an important part of pre-planning for a crisis is where are you going to centralize those volunteers? Who's going to manage those resources? What phone number do you want them to call? Need to have that ahead of time because that's an important phone number to get out to the news media. We didn't have that at the time. And every organization in the community were getting these calls from people wanting to help, not only from within our community, but from across the United States and in some cases around the world. Our public library, the first 4 hours after the crash, received 140 phone calls of people wanting information about Sioux City and people offering services. Those calls were coming into the 911 center. They were plugging up the operators and taking up the operators' time within the 911 center of people calling there. That's your point of contact. Those people are very busy. You need to have an organization set up just to manage those community resources that are going to want to help. That phone number needs to be out on the airwaves early, very early in the crisis. We even now have gone so far as we have a location that we can put out in the community for anybody that wants to help. They can go to that location. The Red Cross organizes and the Salvation Army organize a lot of those resources for us.
Some of the things that we found that we thought we need to look at more carefully with the amount of volunteers we have going through is a volunteer registration point. Any citizen that comes in can say that we have CPR or first aid training if you need us, or we have some disaster training. We need to get something set up where they can fill out a card and we can put it in a master file, and then the command post where the Salvation Army and the Red Cross would be set up at would be able to pull those names out as they need them. Instead of sending people that come in and say, I want to help, say, okay, why don't you go to the morgue or something like that. We'd rather be a little more organized in where we send our volunteers to. So as they call in and say, can I help, we'd like to have a sheet set up that they can fill out saying, this is where you can contact me at, this is when I'm available, these are the resources I have. We also have a thing that we call signed agreements between different businesses in the communities. With that, we have restaurants, hotels, and schools, for examples, where they come in and they sign a sheet saying that when something occurs, we can count on this service from them.
When a disaster occurs, news media needs to know a lot of information. They need to know about injuries and the nature of those injuries, and they need to know about fatalities and certainly how the disaster occurred. But what you can do is you can look for a lot of side features as you're working with the media as the days and the weeks go by. You can find out about special circumstances where people came forward to help a patient, where families are coming in. Sometimes you might find that somebody was lost in the disaster situation but then found. So there are actually many, many heartwarming human scenarios where people are interacting with and caring for other people. And actually when a disaster occurs, those of us who are reading the newspaper, listening to the radio, watching television, those are the stories we want to see. Yes, we want to know about the lives that were lost. We do want to know about the injuries. We want to know about the nature of the injuries. We want to hear the success stories. We want to hear and see people caring for people. And when a disaster strikes, you want to look for that. And you want your public relations people to be at the ready to be able to help a reporter. Here's a person to call. Here's an interview. Here's some video you can shoot. And then people are celebrating caring for the human spirit. That's why we're all fascinated with watching disasters on national news and reading about them in the paper, because we're looking for those heartwarming case studies where people are caring for people, and then we celebrate that. And you're generating incredible employee pride. And then people feel that not only among themselves in their own buildings, but they also hear that from their friends and neighbors. And if they see accounts of it in the news media, it's the icing on the cake. It validates what they do and generates a lot of pride about what they chose to do for their life's work, which is care for other people. And as tragic as a disaster can be, when it allows people to care for other people in a very large scale, it really generates a very positive side to it.
The regional disaster response was a team effort. Everyone worked together. People saw what needed to be done and did it. God worked through all of us. He saved Spencer. I just carried him.